Mist hangs over Scotland like a memory that refuses to settle. Stone arches and ruined curtain walls push through low cloud, their silhouettes sharpened by a light that has learned to live with gray. Where roads thin to single tracks and trees lean in close, the past keeps its breath. It waits in narrow closes and in the vaults beneath old bridges, in the thickness of damp mortar, and in the sudden drop of temperature when no wind moves the heather. Listen, and you hear it. The long, low sigh of history rubbing against the present, sometimes audible as a footstep, sometimes as a whisper carried down a corridor where no living voice belongs. If you stay until the end and want more haunted journeys like this, subscribe, hit the bell, and share the road with others who walk where shadows linger. Number 1. Edinburgh Castle, Edinburgh. Perched on its volcanic plug, Edinburgh Castle commands the city as it has for 1,000 years, a fortress of stone and gun loops, of royal apartments and prisons carved into the living rock. From the esplanade, the silhouette is immovable. From the close below, it appears to loom like a sleeping giant. The air here tastes of salt and soot, of rain and the iron tang of history. And even on ordinary days, a chill finds the bones of those who climb. Visitors report figures at the castle gate, and the dim barracks. A soldier in a grey greatcoat seen pacing where there should be no one. A woman at a window who fades when approached. Guides tell of the regimental ghosts that refuse to leave their posts. Witnesses describe the sudden scent of pipe tobacco in empty chambers, and the metallic echo of marching where only pigeons should coo. Investigators have recorded transient cold spots near the old prisons and have captured low-frequency hums on equipment, anomalies that match neither structural acoustics nor modern interference. Photographs sometimes show orbs skimming the battlements. Sometimes a darker shadow occupies a doorway where no person stood. Historically, the castle has been a royal seat, a barracks, a prison, and, in wartime, a vault of armament. Siege and triumph have left their marks. Cannon scars on stone, names carved in cell walls, graffiti of men consigned to duty. Traditions tie certain rooms to particular tragedies. The prisons are said to bear the weight of countless lonely nights, and locals say the rock itself remembers. Whether these recollections are echoes trapped in stone or the imagination of those who seek evidence, the castle's presence is undeniable. It watches and is watched, and when night gathers on the esplanade, even the bravest visitor feels observed. Number 2. Mary King's Close, Old Town, Edinburgh. Beneath the bustle of the Royal Mile lie streets swallowed by time. Narrow lanes, now subterranean, once thrummed with life. Stalls, children, shopfronts whose wooden signs have long rotted away. The air in the close is close in the literal sense. Stale, cool, the faint smell of earth and old smoke. Lamps carve a small, determined circle of light that the darkness always tries to reclaim. Accounts from tourists and guides have circulated for decades: an invisible child laughing, a woman in a gray dress vanishing through a wall, hands reaching from the blackness. Some say they felt an oppressive weight in their chest as they passed certain doorways. Others describe an abrupt, inexplicable nausea or the sense of having been watched for years. Investigators, working with recordings and infrared cameras, have collected EVPs, snatches of sound that listeners interpret as whispers or distant sobs, and notes of unexplained temperature drops around particular corners. Photographs have captured faint, layered shapes in the archways that resist tidy explanation. The close is doubly haunted, by those who lived their ordinary lives in cramped conditions, and by the many theories about its abandonment and partial burial during periods of urban redevelopment. Local lore has also linked the place to outbreaks of disease in earlier centuries, though historians caution against conflating legend and epidemiology. Guides willingly frame these stories as a tapestry of history and hearsay. Whether one accepts the supernatural reading or sees a space laden with suggestion Descending into the close is to enter a place where time has folded back on itself. Number 3. Greyfriars Kirkyard, Old Town, Edinburgh. A churchyard dressed in lichen and weathered stone, Greyfriars is a catalogue of the city's dead, merchants, lairds, children, those whose names the rain has eaten. Monuments tilt at curious angles, footpaths silted with leaf and memory. There is a distinct smell of damp earth and old lavender, the result, some guides say, of wreaths long left to rot and the particular soil that holds centuries of burial. Visitors often come for the legends. The story of a dog that refused to leave a master's grave is told with affection. Nearby, the figure of a spectral soldier who patrols the northwest quarter has been reported by passers-by and by night shift security guards. Witnesses have spoken of being jostled by an unseen presence near certain mausoleums and of seeing shapes gather between gravestones as a fog bank moves over the kirkyard. Paranormal teams have recorded EVPs that some interpret as responses when questions are posed aloud, and several security cameras have registered quick, unexplained movements in frames where no person appears. Greyfriars is also adjacent to one of the city's darker histories, the Covenanters and the violent clashes tied to religious and political strife. Those historical scars are not always the same as the spectral tales, but they create a substrate of sorrow. Whether the phenomena are residual echoes of grief, the product of suggestion in a place that invites it, or something less understood, the kirkyard remains a locus where the living feel the pull of what has been buried. Number 4. The Southbridge Vaults, Southbridge, Edinburgh. Below a busy modern thoroughfare, a series of vaulted chambers sits like a secret within the city. Once workshops, lodgings, and even illicit taverns, the vaults fell into disuse and were sealed for long stretches. Entering is to descend through time. The brick becomes older, the air becomes damper, and the sound of traffic above turns into a far, muted percussion. Accounts from urban explorers and tour operators are consistent. A sense of being followed, footsteps that cease when a light swings around, a deep, grinding cold along an otherwise intact wall. Some visitors tell of a presence that presses against them, as if to ensure they cannot leave, while others describe an overpowering scent, old ale, rot, and something floral and sweet that has no obvious source. Investigators using thermal cameras have noted unexplained cold pockets and infrared anomalies. Audio recordings sometimes contain murmurs that resist easy classification. Historically, the vaults were part of commercial life, but their abandonment and the dark stories that accrued, murders rumored in corners, bodies said to have been hidden, are often difficult to verify. Where fact ends and storytelling begins is part of the vault's power. They are a place where the imagination is offered a map, and where in the hush beneath the bridge, suggestion and architecture conspire to make the skin prickle. Number 5. Glamis Castle, Angus. Rising from manicured lawns, Glamis Castle strikes an image of an ancestral seat kept both for show and secrecy. Its turrets and chimneys create a skyline of domestic power, and yet the stone is scarred by legends. Rooms closed to visitors, corridors that twist like memory, and a hush in halls that have seen generations. Reports here are wide-ranging. Visitors speak of a figure in white seen moving across a distant gallery, and staff have for years told of doors opening on their own, and of an atmosphere that shifts from warm to icy at particular thresholds. Local legend holds the existence of a child with deformity hidden from history. Guides usually frame such tales as family lore, a narrative handed down and softened into myth. Paranormal teams have documented sudden EMF spikes in certain chambers, and have captured whispers on digital recorders that defy immediate explanation. Glamis's history is layered. Noble families, childhoods lived against castle etiquette, and the slow accumulation of domestic tragedies typical of an old house. Shakespearean echoes, associative rather than documentary, hang over it,
And the castle's own archive of portraits, wills, and household inventories shapes how people imagine its past. Its hauntings, then, exist in the tension between the intimacy of a home and the architecture of secrecy. Visitors feel both welcomed and observed. Number 6. Cawdor Castle, Nairnshire. Cawdor crouches among trees as if it grew there rather than being raised by hands. Ivy ropes around the stones in places, and the low light filtering through the canopy puts the castle's face into soft relief. A certain smell lingers in the rooms: old wood, beeswax, and the faint, almost indiscernible echo of smoke. The castle is bound to Shakespeare's Macbeth in popular imagination, and local tradition leans into that connection with
A gentle rooms that evoke regicide, a chamber sometimes described as hosting a sleepy lady, and a raven's nesting place that gives rise to tales of omens. Witnesses have reported the sensation of cold breath on the neck while alone in the chapel, and have sensed footsteps where none logically should occur. Investigators have occasionally recorded EVPs that practitioners parse as names or staccato murmurings, and photographs sometimes present light flares along staircases. Historians remind visitors that the Shakespearean narrative diverges from the historical record, and local storytellers are careful to label much of the castle's spectral catalog as tradition rather than proof. Still, for many who pass beneath its stone arches, Cawdor's walls are repositories of stories that have a way of feeling true whether or not they are literally accurate. Number 7. Culloden Moor, near Inverness. A wide, low plain that accepts the horizon and returns little. Culloden is unadorned, its grasses flattened by wind and weather. In the rain, the earth smells of peat and iron, a reminder of the lives spent here and the finality of battle. Standing stones and sparse markers mark where the wounded once fell, and the ground itself seems reluctant to forget. Eyewitnesses, particularly those who come at dusk, speak of phantom drums and the sudden pop of musket fire where there are no reenactors and no storm to explain the sound. Some claim to feel hands at their shoulders, as if steadying them, while others report seeing figures in period dress moving at the edge of sight before dissolving into the mist. Investigators have recorded low-frequency noises that some attribute to natural ground hums and others to something more ambiguous, and thermal imaging on certain nights has produced brief flickers of warmth that do not correspond to living bodies. Culloden's history is sharp and well documented. The bloody battle of 1746, the crushing of a cause, and the pain that followed. The cultural memory here is raw. For many, the field is sacred ground. Whether the sensations reported are psychological echoes in a place of concentrated grief, acoustic artifacts birthed by landscape and weather, or something else, visitors often leave with an acute sense that the past has not finished its business here. Number 8. Stirling Castle, Stirling. Balancing between highlands and lowlands, Stirling Castle is both strategic perch and palace. Its courtyards open into broad skies, and the heating of sunlight on stone can feel generous on a calm afternoon. Yet its vaults and chambers carry quieter shades, the hush of royal apartments and corridors that have seen counsel and betrayal. Accounts of spectral company here include a gray lady reported by staff in the royal quarters, and the occasional sighting of an armed man on the battlements long after the visitor hours end. Some nighttime security personnel have described footsteps that echo in empty stairwells and the distant clatter of armor when no one else is in the building. Paranormal investigators have recorded physiological responses, elevated heart rates, skin conductivity spikes, in small teams moving through certain rooms, and electromagnetic readings that fluctuate without clear modern cause. Stirling's historical record, sieges, coronations, royal residences, provides a richly textured backdrop. The castle's role in national identity, particularly during moments of conflict, seems to intensify the feeling that history is present. Those who pass through the gate report both awe and a prickling sense that decisions made centuries ago still matter to the stones themselves. Number 9. Loch Leven Castle, Kinross. A fortress on an island, Loch Leven is hemmed by water and sky. Its keep rises from the shallow loch like a stern promise. The air around it carries peat, reed, and the faint odor of lake water gone cool. A short boat ride separates visitor from ruin, and the sound of oars on water has a metronomic quality that primes the mind for stories. The castle's most persistent legend involves a queen kept within its walls. Imprisonment and escape are terms used in guidebooks and in the breathless retellings of tourists. Many who visit the island report a sense of confinement that hangs in the damp air of the interior rooms. A pressure that tightens the chest, a feeling that walls hold a memory of forced nights. Investigators have noted electrical anomalies in the lower chambers and have captured recordings that some interpret as the whispering of names or the rustle of skirts where no visitor stands. Historians point to documented records of detainment here. The human stories, betrayal, politics, survival, are accounted for in archives. Tourists, sensing the layers of personal anguish and political theater, leave with a mingled curiosity and pity. The castle's isolation amplifies the personal dimension of history, and for some, the experience is less about spectacle than about a close, uncomfortable intimacy with a past acted on a small, bounded stage. Number 10. Urquhart Castle, Loch Ness. Perched above the expanse of Loch Ness, Urquhart's ruins lean toward the water as if listening. Wind across the loch scours the stones. The lichen is pale and tenacious. From certain viewpoints, the castle frames the water in a way that invites speculation, on monsters, on histories submerged and visible. Local stories mingle the cryptid tales of the loch with the castle's own spookier claims. Visitors have reported a sensation of being watched from the waterline when they stand on the ruins, and sometimes an unexplained drop in temperature near the collapsed keep. Photographs taken at dusk occasionally show lights, or so some believe, moving along parapets, while others have captured indistinct shapes crossing ruins where no paths exist. Investigators who have worked here warn that the open landscape produces strange optical effects, and sonar and photographic equipment sometimes return results that demand careful interpretation. Urquhart's history includes raids and occupations that left scars on its fabric. The castle's decay is as much political as it is chronological. Its proximity to a loch that has long inspired myth gives it a dual role in the public imagination, haunt of human sorrow and partner, a different sort of watery unknown. The result is a place where the sky, the stone, and the water collaborate to make certainty difficult. Number 11. Dunnottar Castle, Aberdeenshire. Clinging to a rocky headland, Dunnottar refuses to be approached without commitment. Waves clip its base, and gulls loop and cry. The approach is brisk and bracing. There is salt in the wind and a steadying seaborne smell that clears the head even as it sharpens the senses. Witnesses speak of apparitions moving along the battlements and a recurring sense of a presence watching from the ruins' inner rooms. At certain points, visitors say they feel an inexplicable heaviness in the limbs, a tiredness that arrives without exertion. Paranormal teams have noted audio anomalies, a thin, distant chorus on old recordings, and thermal cameras sometimes register brief spikes of warmth in corners abandoned for centuries. Dunnottar's documented history is dramatic: sieges, political refuge, treasure moved in secret. These facts anchor the stories told here. Where legend exceeds the archive, local storytellers are careful to call it folklore. The castle's physical exposure, the way weather lays bare its structure, makes it a place where the elements and the past conspire to create sensations that many read as more than natural. Number 12. Fyvie Castle, Aberdeenshire. Fyvie presents itself as a lived-in castle, gardens trimmed, ramparts neat, but within the polished surfaces, the house keeps quieter stories. Rich woodwork and long galleries create an impression of domestic continuity, while hinting at the shadows that gather in corners. Reports from staff and nightly docents include the steady image of a lady in black and the odd impression of being touched on the shoulder in an empty corridor. A child's giggle is occasionally claimed to be heard near lineage portraits, and stray lights have been photographed in closed rooms. Investigators have recorded sudden pressure drops and have sometimes captured breathy sounds on equipment when no one was in proximity. Fyvie's record includes noble lines, marriages, and inheritances, the kind of human detail that embeds sorrow and joy within a home. The castle's ghosts, for those who believe in them, are as domestic as its inventories. They reflect the continuity of family and the secrets kept behind curtains. Number 13, Inverary Jail, Inverary. A different sort of stone building, the old county jail is now a museum, its cells open to the public in a neat interpretive layout. Yet the bars, the ironwork, and the smell of cold stone retain a capacity to unsettle. Guides who lead tours late in the day speak in hushed tones, not always to dramatize. There is a sense here that the architecture was designed to contain. Visitors report a range of phenomena: sudden feelings of claustrophobia in cells that were not crowded, the impression of being watched from a barred window, and the sound of faint, distant clanking like keys. Some have taken photographs that show mists within cells or shapes in doorways. Paranormal investigators have noted EVPs and have recorded equipment readings that spike without clear electrical interference. The jail's history, punishments, sentences, the ordinary business of law and order brings with it ethical considerations. The silence within the cells is not merely atmospheric. It is the residue of people reduced to confinement. Many who visit leave with a sober respect for the lives once lived there and for the work of preserving such a difficult past. Number 14. The Slagachin Hotel Area, Isle of Skye. On Skye, the land bends differently. Hills roll and then arrest themselves in punctuated cliffs, and the weather can shift from bright to brooding in a single step. Near Slagachin, that alternation creates an expectation of change. The hotel and its environs are framed by mountain and river, and the scent of peat and wet wool hangs in the air. Local guides and guests have long swapped tales of spectral riders and of a presence that moves along the mountain pass at dusk. Some walkers report hearing horses' hooves when the road is empty, and a few claim to have seen a solitary rider vanish into the mist. Investigators have recorded sounds that mimic distant movement. Whether these are natural wind patterns through outlets or something less ordinary, people who come here walk more slowly as light falls. Skye's landscape encourages myth. The island's thin soils and steep glens have always been places where people imagined beings in the margins. Stories told at the hotel hearth are carried off by the wind and folded into the landscape until it is difficult to tell whether the mountains are the cause of the tales or simply their canvas. Number 15. Glencoe, the Highlands. A valley held in rock and memory, Glencoe is beautiful in a way that feels close to cruel. The mountains gather rain in their hollows. The air is acidic with peat and with the bitter, clean smell of winter. Small streams stitch the valley floor. The sound is constant and patient. Glencoe's most persistent haunting concerns the massacre of 1692, treachery and blood in a place of hospitality. Visitors to the glen often report that dusk brings an atmosphere heavier than mountain weather alone can explain. Some say they hear a distant chorus like the murmur of men gathered or the odd drumbeat of a camp disturbed. Investigators have noted that natural acoustics here can carry and distort sounds across the valley, but many travelers describe a palpable sorrow that gathers at the low points of the glen. The massacre is a documented event with well-attested consequences. It is a site where history's moral blur becomes a present sensation. The land seems to hold lament. For those who pass through, Glencoe is less about spectacle and more about an encounter, with grief made stone and with the knowledge that certain acts leave traces that a landscape keeps. The tour closes where it began, among stones and weather and stories that refuse easy closure. Each place on this list holds both archive and rumor, record, and the human impulse to explain what the senses cannot accept on their own. Some phenomena are captured on cameras or in the notes of investigators. Others arrive in the quiet of a chamber or the sudden cold at the base of a stair. All of them ask the same simple question: what does the past demand of the present? For many, the answer is reverence. If this journey stirred your curiosity, like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next exploration. Share the video with someone who loves history wrapped in shadow, and tell us which place you'd return to in the comments. After the tour's final images had faded and the music dropped to a hush, there remained a kind of aftertaste. Not the thrill of being frightened, but the gravity of memory lodged in stone and turf. The places we had passed were a catalogue of how lives imprint themselves on landscape, a bedrock of everyday choices, sudden violence, long, small endurance. To trace them is to follow a map of human concern, law and mercy, wrath and obligation, and to see how those concerns persist when the living have moved on. There are other sites off the main circuit where the same pattern repeats in different keys. Number 16, Pluckley, Kent. A country road dips into Pluckley and seems to settle into a single mood: close hedgerows, chimneys, the barrelled church tower. The village bills itself, half joking, as England's most haunted. The claim brings curious caravans and bemused schoolchildren. The catalogue of specters is long: a highwayman, a screaming man, the woman in white, and most accounts read like local theater, shifted by retelling into something larger than a single voice. What matters here is not whether every sighting can be catalogued. It is that a place sustained a common story until it felt real enough to enter other people's evenings. The haunting becomes a communal possession. It structures morning conversation. It shapes the routes walkers take. It is sold and resold as a tourist product. Anthropologists call this placemaking. For the outsider, it reads as a demonstration of how narrative can become topography. Number 17, Borley Rectory, Essex. Borley's story is entangled with publicity and controversy. A tragic rectory, a rumor of a nun, and the obsession of one investigator, the Reverend Harry Price, made it into a sensation of the early 20th century. Photographs, carved inscriptions, reported footsteps, all were marshaled as proof. Later scholars found hoaxes, errors, and the messy human appetite for spectacle. Yet, even where fraud explains detail, something survives that is harder to dismiss: the way grief and rumor amplify. A ruined house is a focus for imagination. Pity and curiosity converge. Borley is an object lesson in the ethics of investigation, the need for careful documentation, for skepticism, for humility, and for reminding us that the stories we demand of the past sometimes ask us to shoulder responsibilities we have not considered. Number 18, Leap Castle, County Offaly, Ireland. Leap sits inland, cut off by bog and lane. It is not only a ruin, but a palimpsest, revisions of stone stacked over centuries of Irish history. The notoriously violent chapter, a blood feud that allegedly left victims in the castle's hidden places, is the source of many accounts. Visitors report sudden nausea, a sense of wrongness in the bloodied rooms. One chamber, known locally as the Bloody Chapel, is said to retain an odor, a heaviness that is more than air. The stories around Leap complicate easy readings. Folklore and recorded violence braid together. Archaeology shows layers of habitation. What investigators often find is that the more they look, the more human complexity emerges. Old justice systems, cults of vengeance, the slow feeding of rumor into myth. Leap teaches that any claim about the past must reckon with a tangle of sources, oral, written, material, and that the uncanny often sits on top of very ordinary, very human acts. Number 19, Chillingham Castle, Northumberland. In the Great Hall of Chillingham, the light slants low, and there is an atmosphere that has less to do with ghosts and more with history's stubborn residue. The castle preserves relics of conflict, confinement, rooms where prisoners waited, passageways designed for defense, courtyards that have heard shouts for centuries. The reports here often describe sounds, clanking, murmurings, the impression of figures moving at the edge of vision, but they arrive alongside a strong institutional memory. The castle is a site that cultivates its own past.
Guides recount incidents as if they were part of an ongoing chronicle. There is a moral question embedded in that presentation: how to keep history alive without turning pain into entertainment. Chillingham's answer is partial. Its narrative is both a service to memory and a form of commodification, and the contradiction itself is instructive. Preservation requires income. Storytelling requires simplification. Neither of these necessities is necessarily evil, but both demand care. Number 20. Housestead's Roman Fort, Hadrian's Wall. In the ruins of a fort where soldiers once kept watch, the uncanny is often subtle. An outbuilding becomes a focus when photographs show an unexplained shape. A visitor reports a chill that descends as if the walls remembered the weight of armor and the routine of sentry duty. Archaeologists caution against romanticizing. Here are discrete artifacts and stratified deposits that tell stories of deployment, logistics, and empire. Yet the fort also shows how long human energies can linger. Empires dissolve, but the imprint of people living and dying in a place is structural. At Housesteads, the sensation is less spectacle than continuity. The same human concerns, belonging, discipline, mortality, recur in the same stones. That sense of continuity is often what people name as a visitation, not spirits in a narrow metaphysical sense, but a palpable sense of humanity's endurance. Number 21.
Whitby Abbey, North Yorkshire. Whitby is a place of sea light, gull cries, and abbey towers that pierce the sky like a ledger of vows. The ruin has been a magnet for romantic poets and for those who read the sublime as an index of otherness. Visitors report figures on the cliff edge, a cloaked presence in the nave. Others speak of a melancholy that arrives with the wind. Dracula's shadow hangs over Whitby, an example of how literature and legend can fold into lived experience. Here, the lesson is about media and myth, how a novel can transform a ruin into a symbol that later visitors carry with them. The abbey is both a historical ruin and a set piece from the imagination, and the two feed one another. The interplay complicates any simple attribution of sightings to either the past or to narrative priming. Number 22. The Vicarage at Downton? Small apologies to the fictional. There are lesser-known parishes where stories accumulate quietly. A child's laughter behind a locked door, a chair that is found moved, a bell that rings when the rector is away. These incidents are not headlines, they are the private evidence of households. They are, perhaps, the most ethically demanding because they belong to living people who may prefer privacy to pilgrimage. The impulse to document must here yield to a different ethic: consent. Investigators and broadcasters sometimes forget this. The drive to capture a sound or an image can eclipse the presence of real grieving people. Visiting, taking photographs, and publishing with wild claims can harm communities. Responsible work requires asking whether the uncovering of a story will comfort or will wound. The methods used in contemporary investigation can be as revealing as the phenomena they aim to capture. Equipment, thermal cameras, EMF meters, digital recorders, promises certainty. Yet the readings these devices provide are ambiguous. An electromagnetic spike may have a mundane source: wiring behind a wall, a passing vehicle, a faulty transformer. Thermal images can be skewed by drafts or sunlight. Audio can be shaped by suggestion. Evocative technical results do not always prove an extraordinary ontology. They prove that something unusual happened in the moment the instruments were running. The interpretation of that something is where human judgment comes in. There are, however, moments when evidence resists easy dismissal. A recording of a voice that speaks across miles of silence, saying a name unmistakable to a family. A photograph that consistently shows a figure only in certain light angles. Multiple independent witnesses who recount the same odd pattern at the same hour. These cases provoke a different kind of response, a careful triangulation that combines testimony, material context, and a disciplined search for natural causes before any extraordinary claims are made. But beyond methods and hardware, there is a deeper current that unites the sites: the moral landscape. Hauntings often cohere where injustice, loss, or abrupt rupture has occurred. A massacre leaves silence. A prison leaves a claustrophobic hush.
A burned house leaves a scent that some describe as apology. Whether one believes in spirits or not, the sensibility remains. Certain human actions bequeath obligations to the living. Memory is not merely a retrieval of facts, it is a demand for response. That demand shapes how communities manage places. In some locales, conservationists have worked with descendants and local groups to create interpretation centers that honor victims. Elsewhere, entrepreneurs have transformed eerie reputations into profitable experiences, without much regard for those who suffered. The difference is not only economic, it is ethical. How do we turn history into pedagogy rather than spectacle? How do we invite curiosity without commodifying grief? Our last nights on the road made these questions unavoidable. There were moments of wonder, a photograph that captured a mist pooled in a doorway, the silence of a ruin at moonrise, and moments of constraint, a posted sign that forbade access to a cellar, a local woman's quiet refusal to have a long interview because that story is for my family. It was the refusals that stayed longest with me. They reinforced the sense that not every question deserves an answer. On a wet morning, after a night spent in a small inn whose wallpaper had been patched many times over, I walked again among stones that remembered other lives. The wind came in from the sea, carrying salt and peat. A shepherd dog watched me from a low wall. I thought how often people say they visited somewhere because they wanted to feel the uncanny, when what they really sought was a contact with what came before them. That contact can be generous. It can also be invasive. So what, finally, does the past demand of the present? Reverence, certainly. A willingness to hold pain without turning it into entertainment. Patience, yes. An acceptance that discernment takes time and that not every phenomenon will be explained on a single night. And restraint. A readiness to step back when the pursuit infringes on human dignity. There is a temptation in ghost hunting culture to accumulate proofs, to build a portfolio of images and EVPs that will prove something once and for all. The true work is different. It is an attentiveness to the texture of place, an effort to learn its histories honestly, and a habit of care toward the living who remain tied to those places. It would be dishonest to close without acknowledging the allure. The uncanny teaches something useful. It unsettles the easy narratives. It insists that the past is not quite gone. It presses against the neatness of dates and gravestones. In that pressure we can find humility, the recognition that our explanations are provisional, and that sometimes history insists on its own terms. The van we had used for the tour turned back toward the lowlands. Conversation in the back was quieter than earlier in the trip. People sifted through new images on their phones, compared notes, offered small, private theories. A guide packed her maps with the practiced motions of someone who has carried other people's curiosity for years. We left stones behind as the road rose and the weather shifted. Over the radio, the host gave a brief list of sources and a reminder to respect closures. There was a pause, the kind that signals the end of something not only practical, but human. Then ordinary life resumed. Farms, a dog walker, a motorway junction. The uncanny receded, but not entirely. Memory had moved with us. Stories travel faster than stones. There are more sights, more stories, and more responsibilities. If this journey had a lesson, it was that curiosity without care can wound, while care without curiosity can stifle truth. The best approach, whether you seek to visit, to research, or simply to listen, is a mixture. Curiosity directed by restraint, wonder tempered by reverence. There are still recordings and notes to sort, interviews to transcribe, and, inevitably, a list of places we did not reach. The road keeps its promises in part because it never really ends. For now, the sites we visited continue to exist in their small independences. The jail that holds its quiet, the hotel on Skye where riders slip through mist, the valley of Glencoe that gathers lament. They remain, as they always were, places that ask something of those who pass through. At the guest house, the day folded into rain and the kitchen light smelled of frying onions and tea. People drifted in one by one, some too tired for words, some restless with the habit of talking through what they had seen. Maps lay on the table, damp at the corners. A guidebook lay open to a page that had been underlined so many times its paper had the soft texture of muscle memorized by touch. Someone put on a record. Old folk tunes scraped at the room's edges like an attempt to summon steadiness. I set my recorder on the small desk beneath the window and pressed play. The files from the day were a tangle. Interviews half-started, the thin, brittle sentences of elderly voices, the definite clicks and coughing of people who had been speaking for a lifetime and found one fragment they could not let go of. There were EVPs in there too, little bumps of sound barely formed, a breath in the dark, a syllable that might be a name or might be the tape wanting to be music. Listening in the quiet of that room felt different from listening in the dark under a stone arch. Now, the ghost of the hut's hearth seemed to press against my shoulder, asking whether we had the right to keep what had been given so tentatively. We argued that night about an image, a photograph taken through a doorway, the mist pooled like a second floor of the world. The host wanted to run it with the episode's headline, an emblem that would pull listeners in.
By the thousand. The guide frowned and said the woman who had opened that door had not wanted the house named. She asked for care, the guide said, not proof. The host counted potential clicks. He had spent years learning how curiosity translated into survival for a show. The line between livelihood and exploitation ran through him like a fracture. No one was innocent in that room. Who would be? We were all trying to do something honest in economies that rewarded spectacle. When the question becomes money, the answers complicate. One of the younger members, she had been silent most of the tour, photographing stones with minute attention, spoke quietly about crowdfunding. How could we share these stories widely without flattening them? She suggested an approach I had not expected, a fund that would pay for local archiving and for small payments to families who contributed oral histories. The idea landed between us like a coin. Practical, perhaps, but even practicality needs to be pursued gently. In the end, we made a set of rules, less a manifesto than a practical list that would stand between curiosity and harm. We would ask before publishing names. We would supply copies of recordings to those who wanted them. We would anonymize when requested. We would avoid dramatic labels like haunted when the word mourning fit better. We would offer some share of any profits to local groups who worked to remember. These rules felt inadequate and necessary by turns, an attempt to translate ethics into habit. After the meeting, I walked back toward the harbor. Rain had washed the street, and the light pooled in a dull, steady way. I passed the small museum that sat on a corner, an earnest place with a hand-painted sign and an old woman arranging postcards in a display. Earlier, because there had been little time, we had left without going in. Now, the museum's lights were on. In its window, a single photograph had been mounted. It was of a child and a greyhound on a lawn. I paused. Inside, the museum smelled of dust and lemon oil. Shelves held folded letters and a broken boot with a note tied to it in red string. A younger man, one of the woman's grandsons, was there, and he greeted me with the sort of recognition born of a small town where all visitors are noted and catalogued by their shoes. We spoke about the house on the route. He corrected the dates a little, and then, with a look that suggested he had been waiting for permission to say more, told me about his grandmother's decision to open that small museum. She wanted a place, he said, that would hold both the thing and the person. People would come and look, but they'd come into a room where the object is already tied to a life. That stops some of the thirst. He rubbed his hands as if warming them on a kettle he had started months ago. He explained how
the museum had been founded not to attract tourism, but to answer a worry. In the years after, relatives had come back from far away to see the items. Schoolchildren came on tidy afternoons. Descendants sat in a back room to read letters aloud. The place had rules of its own. No photography without explicit permission, and a stipend for the village to maintain the roof.
When the town's fortunes were low, the museum became a center for modest work, mending, cataloging, teaching local children how to handle brittle paper. "It teaches younger people how to ask," the grandson said. "It teaches them there are ways to look without taking." There was, in that museum, a different economy. It was not spectacle in the big sense. It did not sell an experience of fright. It sold, quietly, an invitation. Come, learn, remember. The difference between that and the exploitative attractions we had seen on the trip was the difference of listening with consent and listening without it. One demanded accompaniment, the other only the customer's thrill. Back in the guest house, I worked on transcripts until the light thinned into blue. Transcribing is an intimate labor because it requires presence. You inhabit pauses and the unevenness of memory. You learn to notice the small corrections a speaker makes, how a person will say, "It happened," and then add, "Not like that, not really," as if rewinding to spare something. Those corrections were the work's currency. They told us what had to be moved or omitted in any public telling. There was a recording I returned to again and again, the voice of a man who had been in the jail as a boy, later a gardener, now old. He had spoken about a night in which sounds came from the cell where a man had been left to die. He had said the sound had been a small music, like the clapping of two stones. He had paused often. "It's not a ghost I want to tell you about," he said finally. "It's a small kindness. The men inside used to name things to remember them. They would call the cold September, like it was a person. Naming kept them human. That is what stayed with my father, names, not spirits." When I listened later in the dark, some small thing in the recording made me feel that the man's meaning would be lost if we slapped a label on it that fit a headline. We tentatively planned a piece that would focus less on the uncanny and more on how people keep memory alive. Rather than dramatizing a door that speaks, we would let the voices say how they had made a life alongside that memory. That felt like lowering the temperature of the story. It felt like a refusal of the thrill people expected. Yet it also felt truer. Even as we rearranged the material, practical questions pressed. Who would we contact for permissions? How would we archive the files? Which photographs should
Remain unpublished? We set up a small schedule, calls to descendants, an offer to donate high-resolution files to the local museum, an attempt to write an explanatory piece on ethics for our listeners. These were small, procedural things that insisted on follow-through. The next morning, the sky cleared in a sudden, almost rude brightness. The stone lanes dried quickly, and children ran through the streets in socks and bare feet. A dog trotted past and nosed at a discarded ribbon. The ordinary continued as if it had never been interrupted by our arrival. That continuity was another injunction. The past exists inside ordinary life, braided into making tea, into the hum of a kettle, into looking after a roof. To remember responsibly was to recognize that the living require attention as much as the dead. Before we left town, the grandson of the museum woman handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note and a photocopy of a photograph we had not seen. A group of people standing by a stone wall, some laughing, some solemn. His note said, simply, "If you use it, please say we'll be listening." It felt like a covenant. We said we would. As the van doors closed and the road pulled at the tires, there was a sense not of a completed circuit, but of an extended assignment. We had collected images and voices and the weight of decisions to come. The itinerary of a tour had become the work of stewardship. There would be edits to make, permissions to secure, and long evenings of cataloging ahead. There would also be smaller followings, letters from descendants, questions from listeners, perhaps the occasional complaint. That was all as it should be. Attention begets response. And yet, even with prudent rules and slow work, there remained a friction I could not fully reconcile. The human urge to know versus the human need to protect. The lesson of the trip was not that one must always choose curiosity or always choose care. It was that one must learn to live with the tension, to make practices that honored both. We could be curious and also stop ourselves. We could be hungry and also feed others first. We drove on, the coastline rolling beside us like a book's margin. In the back, someone hummed an old tune, and the rest joined in as if remembering the rhythm mattered more than remembering the words. The stones we had left behind lay quiet under their grass. The museum's lights would blink on and off with the dusk. The grandson would take down coats and perhaps mend a torn postcard. There would be more sights ahead, more stories not yet asked for, and perhaps more refusals. Small, sharp resistances that insist a certain decency. The road keeps asking the same question in different languages. What will you do with what you hear? We had, for the moment, a list of answers, and more importantly, a discipline of asking permission before we called anything final. We pulled over for coffee at a small shop where the counter smelled of cinnamon and the owner kept a ledger with pensions and births. As we sat, our conversation drifted from questions of archive to something simpler and more human: how to teach the next person who comes along to look and not take. A guide suggested workshops. Another proposed sending the young photographer to the museum to learn cataloging. It felt like planting a small, patient defense against appropriation. Outside, a child on a bicycle rode past carrying a plastic bag of stones as if they were treasure. He stopped for a moment and looked at us, then at the shoreline, then pedaled on. The sight made me think of the museum's rule, that there are ways to look without taking. Perhaps that is all stewardship ever asks, less a law and more a habit, learned slowly and passed on like a careful whisper. We turned the van toward a line of hills that promised more ruins, more questions, and perhaps more answers of a different sort. There would be nights of listening, days of decision, and a long, awkward apprenticeship in manners of attention. For now, the recordings were shelved and labeled, the maps were folded, the rules were written on a slip of paper and placed into the guest house's drawer. We drove on. The coast narrowed to a fine horizon, and the low sky seemed to hold both weather and memory in a single breath. The tour would continue, but so would the work that followed it. A slow, deliberate sorting of what belonged to public knowledge and what belonged to a quiet cupboard where family keeps its light.